Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Left Book Club event. Tonight, we'll be discussing Manning Marable's How Capitalism Underdeveloped Black America, Problems in Race, Political Economy, and Society. We have some incredible speakers under one virtual roof, so we're all really happy to have you join us. My name's Elif, and I work with the Left Book Club on events and political education. A little bit about the Left Book Club. We're a subscription book club and not-for-profit initiative. We seek to foster a spirit of collective learning and political education. We aim to create spaces and avenues where people can learn from each other and discuss radical ideas that inform actions and practical steps, with the goal of supporting the struggles fighting for us all. We try to put on as many interesting events as possible, and some of our events have featured speakers such as Kate Mann, Grace Blakely, Kojo Koram, Lewis Gordon, Gargi Bhattacharya, Harsha Walia, Lola Olufemi, Dalia Gabriel, and our discussions engage with a wide range of radical thought. During this event, don't forget to ask your questions on the live stream chat, on the live stream that you're watching us right now. And if you would like to become a member of the Left Book Club, please visit leftbookclub.com and click Become a Member. Alternatively, you can start by subscribing to our mailing list, and all the links are in the description of the YouTube live stream that you are watching. Also, don't forget to follow us, the Left Book Club, on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook to keep up to date with our events, promotions, and giveaways. We have some exciting ones, and particularly for May, in line with some of our Radical May program. Again, subscribe to our YouTube while you're watching us, and just like a note of caution that I like to mention, if the connection happens to go choppy, because all of us are living in Wi-Fi land at the moment, just bear with us and we will definitely make sure that gets sorted. We haven't really had any issues with our events until now, but just a little warning just in case. So this event is a discussion on How Capitalism Underdeveloped Black America by Manning Marable. When we decided to publish this book, and we're also initially organizing this event, we didn't realize just how crucial this discussion will be, particularly now and particularly for Britain. Of course, this discussion is always live and relevant, but it has taken on another meaning, particularly in the last few weeks. And, we'll be discussing, and the book is said to be a classic study of the intersection of racism, class, and patriarchy in the United States and beyond. And hopefully we'll touch on many of those topics tonight. One of our main speakers tonight is HLT Kwan, who is a political theorist, an award-winning filmmaker, and an associate professor in the School of Social Transformation at Arizona State University. Her research centers on movements for justice and race, gender, and radical thought. Her monograph, Growth Against Democracy, is a radical critique of modern development thought and policies. Her current book project, Against Tyranny, Ungovernability, and Tools for Democratic Living, explores willful resistance to various forms of governing. Through Quad Productions, C.A. Griffith and Kwan produced and directed short and feature documentaries such as Mountains That Take Wing, Angela Davis and Yuri Kochiyama, A Conversation on Life, Struggles and Liberation, America's Home, a film about gentrification and displacement in Puerto Rico, and most recently, Bad Form, Queer, Broke and Amazing, a film about LGBTQ plus people and the struggle for economic justice in the United States. Kwan is the editor of the recent collection of essays by Cedric J. Robinson on racial capitalism, Black internationalism, and cultures of resistance. We also have Paul Heidemann, who writes for Jacobin and is the editor of Class Struggle and the Color Line, American Socialism and the Race Question between 1900 and 1930. He is a teacher in New York City. Dr. Avia Sarah Day is a lecturer in criminology at Birkbeck, University of London, as well as an activist in the East End chapter of Sisters Uncut. Sisters Uncut is a national direct action collective fighting cuts to domestic violence services, as well as state violence. Avia's PhD, titled Partnership and Power, Domestic Violence, the Women's Sector and the Criminal Justice System, applied an intersectional approach to women's sector partnership with the criminal justice system, focusing specifically on gender, class, race, immigration status, and disability. Her research interests are survivor criminalization, transformative justice, and prison abolition. I mean, even reading all of those biographies, I think, tells everyone who is already listening to us tonight that it will be a very important discussion about the themes of Manning Marable's books. So to start off, with no further ado, I want to call on Paul Heidemann for his presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Elif, and thanks for having me. I was just really excited when I heard that you were doing a book club on Manning Marable, because I feel like in this moment in which Black radicalism is getting much more recognition, certainly in the United States, than it has for quite a long time. Like, the New York Times columnist Jamel Bouie cited James Boggs in his New York Times column. That was a very important Black radical thinker in the United States. Almost certainly the first time he was ever cited in the New York Times, decades after he died. And so there's been a kind of resurgence of attention to Black radical thought. Again, speaking for the United States, the context I know. But oddly, I feel like Marable has been left out of it, which is strange when you consider he was one of the most prominent Black radical theorists in the United States, certainly in the 80s and 90s, and really up until his death in 2011. And he's someone whose work I think is endlessly rewarding and really was a frighteningly productive scholar when you consider his pace of putting out work. So I was so happy that that the Left Book Club decided to do this event. What I want to do here is just give a very brief kind of intellectual biography of Marable and the making of How Capitalism Underdeveloped Black America, just to provide some kind of context for how he came to write this book and where it fits in his kind of career as a thinker. So, and there's kind of two things that really come to mind as being worth talking about here. On the one hand, Marable's concerns, class exploitation, racial oppression, the intersection of patriarchy and gender oppression with these, are tremendously contemporary in the way he frames them. I mean, really going back and reading that chapter, Grounding with My Sisters, it's quite striking that was written in 1982, right? In terms of how seriously Marable took gender oppression and how diligently he worked to combine an analysis of it with an analysis of racism and capitalism. So his concerns are very contemporary. On the other hand, Marable's his formation, his intellectual formation, is one that I think is very foreign to the present moment, in that he came to write this book as a kind of self-critique of the Black nationalist politics that he had held for the decade or so prior to the book's publication. And that is an intellectual journey that was obviously much more common in the wake of the huge Black nationalist explosion in the United States in the second half of the 1960s and in the early 1970s. It's something that I think in our moment is much, much less common for someone to have gone from being a serious, dedicated Black nationalist activist to becoming a Marxist. So Marable kind of combines the contemporary and something that's very foreign to our present moment, and I think a really interesting way in this book that just makes it very fruitful to think about. So, to go into Marable's intellectual biography, Marable was born into the Black middle class in Dayton, Ohio. His parents were upwardly mobile, and though his dad had to work 2 jobs to put his kids through college and to keep their house, his mom got a PhD in education, and this would have been around in the late 1950s, early 1960s, at a time when the fraction of Black Americans getting a PhD would have been very, very small. So he was born into the small Black elite that despite their status and their ability to have a middle class lifestyle in many respects, still felt the sting of American racism in all kinds of ways, and were really not very far removed from the more proletarianized sections of the Black population. And Marable grows up in the 50s and 60s, so he comes into adulthood watching the classic phase of the civil rights movement. The Montgomery bus boycott, the campaign campaign in Birmingham, the March in Selma, right? The March on Washington. All of these classic moments of the civil rights movement came as Marable was a young man. And actually, he as he's watching these things happen and learning to cover starting to think about them, he actually is sent by his hometown black newspaper to Martin Luther King's funeral in 1968 to cover it for it. So he attends Martin Luther King's funeral. And that is kind of his beginning career of his journalistic career, which he would later say was kind of the central political anchor in his life, was his career writing for black newspapers, which he did very extensively throughout his entire life. And many of his books are actually just collections of the articles that he published for black newspapers around the country, which we'll return to. Marable goes to college and studies history. He's the first Black American to get a PhD from the University of Maryland, a very prestigious history department in the United States. He writes his dissertation on the founder of the African National Congress. And after this, Marable gets a job at the Tuskegee Institute, which, if you know something about American Black history, is associated with Booker T. Washington, a very conservative figure in Black American politics. So there's an irony that Marable gets his start, his real academic start there. But at this same time, when Marable is kind of going through grad school, he makes a couple moves. First, when he was in college, Marable had started a radio station, his own kind of college radio show, which was like a black news and culture show. And again, it's this kind of, he early on, he forms this conviction that, you know, his intellectual work and his scholarship has to be really organically bound with the forms of popular media that ordinary Black Americans would be engaging with. It couldn't remain in academic journals. It couldn't remain in books published by university presses. And that's something he was really committed to throughout his life. And at the same time, you know, in graduate school, Marable is really starting to read deeply. And at this time, he says there's three thinkers who really influenced him. The first is W.E.B. Du Bois, who Marable would go on to write a very good biography of that I absolutely recommend. The great, you know, the greatest American intellectual of the 20th century. The second is Frantz Fanon, author of Black Skin, White Masks and Wretched of the Earth, the anti-colonial thinker. And the third is Walter Rodney, who wrote the classic How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, from which obviously Manning Marable got the title, How Capitalism Underdeveloped Black America. And Marable says, you know, throughout his life, these three thinkers have really been his lodestars. And through all of them, you know, Marable, so for example, from W.E.B. Du Bois, you know, Marable gets this intense focus on Black American politics, on evaluating the direction of Black American politics, understanding its well springs, right? That was Du Bois' project in many ways as well. From Fanon and Rodney, Marable takes a focus on the international dimension of Black politics that's really striking for a thinker, you know, for someone with his background in an American history department. He goes on and he writes like books about Caribbean and African politics. You know, he really rejects the provincialism of the American Academy in a really forceful way. And that's something I think he takes from Fanon and Rodney. So at Tuskegee, Marable actually establishes contact with an institute in Atlanta called the Institute for the Black World, which was a Black think tank set up by the Black historian Vincent Harding, who's very, you know, was associated with the civil rights movement and a real chronicler of 20th century Black history. And this institute was kind of a think tank that had fellowships, and through it, Marable met C.L.R. James and, you know, Walter Rodney, who was already an intellectual hero of him by that point. So he really establishes contact with the larger world of Black radical intellectual life through this institute. And it was actually 2 hours away. So he had to drive 2 hours there, 2 hours back there. And he said, you know, at some points he was making that journey every week to, you know, to be part of this incredible Black left intellectual sea in Atlanta at the time, which wasn't just in the Institute for the Black World, but also at Clark University, whose graduate students had set up a new Black radical journal, things like that. It was a real, Atlanta in the 1970s was a real center for Black radical intellectual ferment. So around the same time in the mid-1970s, Marable really starts organizing and getting involved in politics, really for the first time. And he gets involved with the National Black Political Assembly, which was a group founded in 1972 by Gary Hatcher, who was the Black mayor of Gary, Indiana. And The Hatcher was probably the leftmost of the wave of Black politicians elected primarily to the mayoralships of American cities in the second half of the 1960s, right? Many American cities by that time had become majority Black as a result of processes like white flight, in which, white residents often fled to the suburbs, and these cities had become majority Black. And up until the mid 60s, most of them were still governed by an almost completely white political class. And in the second half of the 1960s, this really starts to be overthrown. You have Carl Stokes in Cleveland. You have Maynard Jackson in Atlanta. It happens a little later in some other cities like Washington, D.C. or Chicago. But Hatcher was like the leftmost of these people. He actually wrote the introduction to this great book called Class, Race, and the Civil Rights Movement. That's kind of a materialist analysis of changing forms of Black protest in the U.S. But Hatcher, Hatcher in the 1970s, it's clear that the civil rights movement has reached an impasse and people are trying to figure out what's the way forward. Hatcher, along with Amiri Baraka, the playwright, poet, etc., very important Black nationalist figure who was based in Newark, New Jersey, they formed the National Black Political Assembly to be this kind of essentially something like a Congress for Black radicalism in the United States, to debate out Black politics and the way forward. And Marable becomes involved with their efforts. At this time, while he's at Tuskegee, he also begins writing his regular column for Black newspapers. And Marable distributes it free of charge to Black newspapers as long as they give him a complimentary subscription. So he's really an institution builder, right? He's like, you can have my column for free, you can run it for free, but I want to see what's happening in your newspaper at the same time. And finally, in the second half of the 1970s, Marable also starts reading Marxism for the first time seriously, and really starts diving into Marxism and starts really trying to figure out what is the relationship between capitalism and Black oppression. And at the same time, he also gets involved in Marxist kind of movements in the United States. He joins up with the New America movement, which was a movement that was kind of refugees from the New Left, essentially, right? It was a movement of people who had kind of come out of the American New Left and didn't want to follow the various kind of ultra-left groupuscules that proliferated out throughout the 1970s into, various forms of, at their worst, various forms of kind of guerrilla movement tactics, or even kind of trying to industrialize by sending their members to go join unions in the Deep South or in meat packing plants, that kind of thing. The New America movement was for the people who were like, this is not going to work, we need something else. Marable joins up with the New America movement. And in the early 1980s, the New America movement would actually merge with another group to found the Democratic Socialists of America, DSA. And Marable is one of the founding vice chairs of DSA. So the late 70s are for Marable a time of real kind of intellectual dynamism, right? He's engaging with he's meeting C.L.R. James, right? He's reading Marxism for the first time. He's writing for Black newspapers. He's really doing a lot. In the early 80s, Marable identifies the early 80s as a real turning point for himself. And he says that 3 events decisively moved him away from Black nationalism and towards Marxism. And these 3 events, he says, were first the Liberty City riot in 1980 in Miami, which is a riot that today is largely forgotten. More familiar ones like Watts in 1965, or the LA Rodney King riots in 1992. But the Liberty City riot was an absolutely devastating riot, massively, massively destructive. The most destructive riot in American history prior to the Rodney King riots in 1992. Like many of these other riots, it was caused by an incident of the police brutality against a Black man. And Marable actually immediately flew down to Miami and started talking to people. And because his column ran in the local Black newspaper, people knew who he was and kind of wanted to talk to him. So he was able, and he writes an article about it in the journal, The Black Scholar, one of the kind of central journals for the Black intelligentsia in the United States. And Marable says his kind of read of the riot was that it was clear Black nationalist politics had no answer to the problems the riot was identifying. So that's one thing. The second is the assassination of Walter Rodney. So Walter Rodney was assassinated in Guyana in 1980, actually just a few days after the Miami riot. And he was assassinated by the post-colonial president of Guyana, most likely. It's kind of still somewhat unsolved, but most people think he was probably assassinated by the post-colonial president of Guyana, who had really, totally abandoned democracy and ruled in a completely autocratic fashion. And Rodney was a major critic of that. And so Marable was like, look, Black nationalism can't understand why this Black post-colonial president assassinates his Black critic, right? For Marable, he said, I had to move beyond Black nationalism. And then the third is the dissolution of the National Black Independent Political Party, which had been kind of a successor effort to the National Black Political Assembly, and like it, was torn apart by just internal political differences between people like Amiri Baraka and kind of more moderate Black nationalists who were interested in like running as Democrats, that kind of thing. And so Marable says at this time, he's in the early 80s, he's completely rethinking his politics. He also leaves DSA in these years because DSA, led by some kind of older leaders, had really rejected the Jesse Jackson presidential campaign in 1984. And Jesse Jackson had been an aide of Martin Luther King's, and his kind of primary run in 1984 was really an orienting point for a lot of the Black left in the United States in the 1980s. And when DSA rejected it, Marable said, this organization is not for me. This is the context in which he writes How Capitalism Underdeveloped Black America, right? This is this moment of him trying to clarify what he thinks, trying to, and coming to understand that in his opinion, Black nationalism is a dead end in the struggle for liberation, and providing a really ruthless critique of it is why he writes this book. And it's why, in the first chapter, there's this emphasis on there is the position of the Black masses, and then there's the position of the Black elite. And I'll just say one last thing that's really important to understand about what led him to write this book is the emergence of Black conservatism around the Reagan administration, which is something that, in general, I would say the disorientation caused by the election of Reagan on the American left is hard to overstate. So, just one index of this, Ralph Abernathy, who was Martin Luther King's lead aide, endorsed Reagan in 1980. So did Hosea Williams, one of King's other key aides. So two kind of leading figures of the civil rights movement endorsed Reagan. Now, part of that was due to Jimmy Carter's betrayals over the past 4 years. Carter had savagely cut aid to American cities, and those cuts fell, absolutely disproportionately on Black Americans. So part of it was that, but obviously something is going wrong when civil rights leaders are endorsing Ronald Reagan. And beyond that, which, again, there was a kind of tactical logic, as kind of warped as it was to Abernathy and Williams, you also had the emergence of a kind of self-confident cadre of Black intellectuals led by Thomas Sowell, who is still with us to this day, who were, full-throated Black Reaganites. And for Marable, this was something that really had to be understood. Like, well, this and the disorientation that came along with this. So, for example, Charles Hamilton, one of the co-authors with Stokely Carmichael of the book Black Power, praises Sowell and the Black conservatives and is like, this is the really exciting thing happening in Black politics right now. And so Marable, when Marable sees that happening, that's another kind of another force, another impetus to his rethinking of Black nationalism and his move towards a more orthodox Marxism. And so he summarizes his transition as saying, it was becoming clearer to me that a Black nationalist framework was inherently compromised because its theoretical premises were basically incorrect. A nationalist perspective generally minimized the importance of class stratification and income polarization among African Americans. Race, however important, was not the fundamental issue which defined the nature of inequality and oppression within capitalism. Strategies for Black empowerment and solidarity had to be grounded in something beyond skin color. A vision of progressive multiracial coalitions which advocated the democratic transformation of the US political economy and society was necessary to empower and liberate Black people. I made the final transition from the politics of race to the politics of class. So that's how Marable 20 years later summarized his the kind of ideological evolution which led him to write How Capitalism Underdeveloped Black America. And I think I'm towards the end of my time, so I'll just say these years, Marable's intellectual productivity is truly incredible. I mean, the year after this, he writes Race, Reform, and Rebellion, which is, for my money, still the best single volume to read on the American Civil Rights Movement. And I would absolutely encourage everyone to look at what Marable was putting out in these years, get all of it and read it, because it's the work of a thinker who was incredibly honest and self-critical and oriented on figuring out what kind of politics were necessary for Black emancipation, and was willing to change his mind in a way that I think is, the mark of a serious intellectual. So with that, I'll hand it over to my co-panelists. Thanks again for having me.
I should go. Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me. This is it's just an interesting time to be reading Marable's work. Before I go into talking about this, I just want to say that I'm going to focus my remarks to the experiences of the United States, not because I think the scope of the work limits itself to the US, but mostly because I only have 10 to 15 minutes and I'm most familiar and comfortable with the issues of directly impacting lives in the US. So please forgive me for my limited scope. So I think this is an urgent time to be reading Marable, How Capitalism Underdeveloped Black America. In point of fact, and since its initial publication in '83, I don't know that there has been a time when it wasn't necessary to be reading How Capitalism Underdeveloped Black America. So I suppose that is my first point. That is, this is a foundational work for understanding political economy. And I want to say that that is not, I did not misspoke. That is to specify that it is an important work for understanding Black political economy, although it is, but I think it is foundational to understanding political economy in general. Just as we cannot understand world political economy without reading Marx, Mao, or Andrew Gunder Frank, or Walter Rodney, or Fanon for that matter, or along with Adam Smith and others, we cannot understand world political economy without the benefits of Marable's How Capitalism Underdeveloped Black America, or Cedric Robinson's Black Marxism, or Angela Davis, Women, Race, and Class. I think these are foundational work. It's remarkable, and I named these works specifically, because these three works were published around the same time, with Davis being the forerunner with her book about 2 full years before Robinson's and Marable's publication. They were each the fruit of the time that Marable so well captured in the book. It was a time of Reaganomics and Thatcherism, to be sure. It was a time when in which neoliberal economic programs deepened their roots in the metropoles, places like North America and Europe, including the UK. Because of course, deregulation, structural readjustment programs, and repression, and I want to emphasize repression, have been the order of the day for more than at least 3 decades in many spaces in the global South, or what we used to call the Third World. But in the early 1980s, when these works came out, and especially How Capitalism Underdeveloped Black America emerged, the people in the global North, particularly the historically privileged zones of development. So I'm not talking, so the middle class communities, or, well, I'm not talking about the historically marginalized community. I'm talking about the historically privileged zones of development. For the first time, many of these people experienced the internalization of neoliberal economic programming, accompanying by greater political disenfranchisement and social repression. And so, because of course, indigenous community, communities of color, poor communities in general, and especially those in the global South, as I noted, have had to live with these policies for more than several decades by this point. So these policies in many ways were not new to the so-called peripheral community. And in short, and Marable was very clear about this in his reassessment of the 1983 publication, He said, to understand to understand any book for that matter, but especially to understand how capitalism underdeveloped Black America, we have to understand the context in which the work emerged, right? And it emerged what we now know as a neoliberal time, a time of increasing authoritarian encroachment into democratic life forms, not least of which is the emergence of the permanent national security state that relies heavily on mass incarceration of the prison industrial complex, mass surveillance, and the militarization of policing. So reading Marable in the shadows of not just the 1979 killings of 5 anti-racist political activists by the Klan and the Nazis in Greensboro, North Carolina, and the 1980 Miami Rebellion, but also in the shadows of the daily homicidal rituals of police killing of unarmed Black and brown people in the United States. And more than 30 million people taken to the street since last summer, just this year alone, to draw attention to anti-Black violence, to systematic racism and white supremacy. A mass mobilization largely organized and led by young queer women of color, mostly Black femmes. Reading this work in these times, in the shadows of these developments, draws attention to the urgent need for an intersectional analysis of heteropatriarchal racial capitalism and the radical expressions that it engendered. So my first point, right, to put it differently, as we now learn, there is no complete understanding of political economy without understanding the ways in which capitalism relies on particular spaces and bodies and temporalities to enliven its not so mysterious processes of extraction and exploitations. I say this to my graduate students all the time. As the Black philosopher Charles Mill understood, the global racial contract races people, spaces, and temporalities. And there's no getting around understanding capitalism, that is racial capitalism, to borrow Cedric Robinson's term. Capitalism is racial capitalism. And in the modern world or contemporary world, right, we can't do it without. And Marable's book is tremendous in the way that Walter Rodney's work was tremendous, right? Delineating the terms of underdependency. But in my own work, I don't use this term. I use uneven development because there's dependency, and obviously there are limits to the dependency framework, and I don't want to get into it at the moment, but I would say certainly in order to understand how Black communities and brown communities and community of color in general, but particularly Black communities in this country, experience uneven development and differential vulnerabilities, because this system of violence engender that kind of vulnerability. We can't live without Marable, right? So in many ways, we need a sophisticated intersectional framework, right? And a kind of critical engagement with class analysis, which requires the systematic exposition of how capital does its magic, to use Marxian lingo. And what we learn when we do this with works like Marable and Robinson and Davis, particularly Marable with respect to the specificity of the underdeveloping of Black communities of Black America, is that this magic isn't magical. It's not fantastic, but it is material and it is pathological. And it includes heavily on the reliance on the anti-Black or reliance on racist violence, especially anti-Black violence and white supremacy as the mechanics of managerial enforcement. So in other words, Marable, following a long line of Black political thinkers, economists, sociologists, people like W.E.B. Du Bois, Oliver Cromwell Cox, but also Walter Rodney, C.L.R. James, and Frantz Fanon, who understood that racial violence in general, including Jim Crow violence including apartheid and even fascist terms of governing, as a prerequisite of racial capitalism and capitalist development. That this is part and parcel of the technologies to use of governing, racial capitalist governing. And without understanding how intimately linked, how pathological violence is linked up to capitalism, we can't get around it. We can't move beyond it. And so, as Marable intuited, without delineating capitalist patriarchy, without delineating the prison industrial complex, the mass incarceration, there is little hope to fully appreciate capitalism's inventive violence and destruction. And so I agree with my colleague Heidemann that you know, in many ways, if you read this book without knowing the year of its publication, you say, Jesus Christ, this was written when? Because Marable understood at the time where I imagine Davis, well, I actually more than imagine, because I happen to follow significant research for the film on Angela Davis and Yuri Kochiyama. But you know, Davis was organizing and talking about the prison industrial complex and writing about the emergent reliance on prison, right? When Marable's book was published. And so it's interesting to read these works at this time. But again, I just want to press the point that I think the unfortunate effects of white supremacist knowledge production and pedagogy has always been that we bracket certain work and limits its so-called universal or transcendence, whatever terms you want to use it. And so we say, well, this work is only urgent if you are thinking about the state of Black America or Black political economy. And while I think that is certainly, this is an incredibly important work for Black studies and for Black political economy, particularly, it is also completely a missed opportunity if we think that it doesn't have its legibility for the general study of capitalist development. I think one of the most important most important critique of Marx's classical writing in capitalism is what in the very first chapter, where he talked about the Black agricultural workers. And he said, listen, African-American farmers, agricultural workers are the most important workers, laboring class. That is both a historical statement of fact. It is also a refutation of the privileging of the European proletarian industrial class and the missed opportunity, and this is amply done by Robinson in Black Marxism, so I don't need to rehearse here, but a missed opportunity on the part of Marx and Engels to really understand world history. So that's my first point. How much time do I have? I'm good? Okay, thank you. I'll be shorter, I promise. I just have 3 points, and because I wanna hear. I just can't wait to hear more stuff from Avia about the Uncut Collective, and I want to entertain the questions. So the second point I want to make has to do with the importance of this work, not only for thinking about world political economy, but for grounding radical resistance against racial capitalism and heteropatriarchy. And again, I think Paul is right in saying that, look, there's this whole chapter on the need to write about, to acknowledge the contribution of Black women, and I want to push the point that Marable was not just an important thinker; he was, as Paul's talk illustrate, an important institutional builder. There's no question about that. He was an institutional. He believed in organizations and journals, and he was one of the founder and architect of the Black Radical Congress, which recently Barbara Ransby point directly to the BRC as one of the main pillars of the contemporary movement, BLM, Black Lives Matter, and movements for Black lives. So without understanding BLM's radical and deep root, right, without understanding the contributions of BRC, we won't really fully appreciate the kind of deep analysis and praxis that these many young Black queer leaders are doing, are operationalizing in this mass mobilization, perhaps unprecedented, of more than 6 months of consecutive protests, drawing attention to white supremacy and anti-Black violence. So Marable believed in not just scholarship, although I think that he obviously was invested and dedicated his entire life to not Black scholastic, but scholarship that make visible Black thought and Black history and Black mobilization. And I think that's important to note the difference, okay? So he wasn't just collecting names, he wasn't just archiving first and things like that, but he actually was delineating a Black radical tradition and mass movement in a particular way where people can access and make use of. So that's important. What's also important is that he continued to straddle the so-called town and gown, but actually, I think he kind of sort of never really paid much attention to that division between town and gown stuff. Marable was accused at different times, depending on what decade, of being too radical or not radical enough. I think it's very unfortunate that that the year that the Malcolm X biography is published at the same year that he died, because he is not there. Well, he was ill, and then he's not here to essentially defend himself. However we feel about that biography, and to be sure, that book has a lot of spaces for improvement. I think in many ways, Marable was trying to push the boundary of scholarship and activism in the way that Amilcar Cabral was really trying to be both a theorist and a revolutionary at the same time. He continued to task other scholars to tell no lie and claims no easy victory. He, in his assessment of Black studies, for instance, he charged that the field of Black study has left its radical roots. And so what do we learn from how capitalism underdeveloped underdeveloped Black America for pushing forward a critical analysis for movement? Well, we know that there has to be a critique of capitalism. Particularly, there has to be a critique of racial capitalism. We know that in the critique of racial capitalism, we need a critique of patriarchy, of sexism, of misogyny, of the easy practice of whiting out and writing out Black women thought and praxis. And we know that we cannot ignore the encroachment on democratic life by the police, by the prison, and by the state. And he documented this in each of the chapter in terms of the crisis in the Black community, the chapter on Black women and on sexism and patriarchy, and then the chapter on prison. I think that's in many ways this book was written as much for the academy as it was written for activists in the community. As a point of disclosure, I came to this book because when I was in I was active in the anti-apartheid movement. And one of the things I learned in being in the anti-apartheid movement in California was that there was a lot of problem with the racist left. Right? So after we achieved divestment, they said, well, we really need to work around the police and racism within the left. And so then, and we had study groups and things like that. So we read Marable at the height of the Reagan era. So that's how I came to this work the first time. So I think if you think about the fact that in the last particularly 5-6 years or so, under the leadership in many ways of BLM and movements for Black lives, communities of color across the United States and poor community have been organizing around a particular framework, often attributed to the Combahee River Collective statement, attributed to people like Kimberly Crenshaw, attributed to Angela Davis and others. These are leaders who and thinkers and activists who have placed the intersectional framework of race, gender, class, sexuality at the forefront, because we now understand that we can't separate them, because that is one of the inventiveness of racial capitalism. And until we have a toolkit that match the viciousness and the savage violence of capitalism, until we have a toolkit that allow us to understand that, we are not going to get around it. So that's my second point, is that this work is really in many ways, I think he was particularly harsh on himself when he reassessed it and said, I wish I've read it. I've written it more for community people. I would say that, community activists are not as untheoretical as academic imagine them to be, especially this generation of activists. They use terms like racial capitalism. They use terms like the Black radical tradition. They use terms like heteropatriarchy and intersectional. But for them, they're not abstract concepts. For them, they actually live it, and they actually have a way to respond to it. And I think as scholars, we should listen. So that's the second point. So finally, and again, this hopefully will be even briefer, I want to point to the third point of Marable's reassessment of this work. And he noted that perhaps he had put too much weight on the tension between the Black elite and the Black masses. And while I don't think that the rise of Black conservatism was somehow a surprise to Black scholars and activists, because of course there has always been multiple ideological development within the Black views. I think the idea that somehow there's only one monolithic ideological positioning in the Black community is absurd anyway. So, but I do think that there was a lot of investment on the part of how capitalism underdeveloped Black America to draw attention to this particular opportunism on the part of the Black elite. And I wonder if, and here's where I think he was influenced as much by Rodney's How Capitalism Underdeveloped Africa as he was by Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth. And I think what he was trying to do was extend a similar analysis that Fanon did with the native elite, right, in Fanon Wretched of the Earth, with the Black elite in the United States. But at no point in the United States, but particularly at the time that Marable was writing this book, was the Black bourgeoisie ever had controlling influence over the political directions or trajectory of this country. And so, nearly 20 years later, he recognized that Marable, that is, recognized that in some way, no matter the difference or even the dialectical tension between the Black elite and the Black masses, that the issue is really about the incredible wealth gap and the of the racial wealth gap in this country, but also in every indicators of development. You could look at life expectancy, you could look at infant mortality, you could look at savings or home ownership. There's this massive wealth gap between Black and white people in this country, and he saw that really as much more of an issue than I think when the book was initially written. And to me, I think it's worth noting that in this particular moment, that is to say, the wealth gap both between Black and white, as well as between the upper wealth echelon of the Black community and the majority, are even more intense than 20 years ago when Marable provided the assessment. I think part of the violence that we are now witnessing that is inflicting on the Black community, in part has to do with this extreme wealth inequality and the increasingly reliance on repression to maintain and sustain this unsustainable system, but also in part that there's that there is enough, I suppose, incorporation of certain segment of the Black community, however small that is, into the upper 1% echelon, that it makes it somehow more seductive for corporations and even the national government to join in the performative celebration of Juneteenth or whatever the particular moment might be. But I think it would be a mistake to read that as somehow a sign of progress. And I think if nothing else, the millions of people, 28 to 32 million, just the last 6 months of last year alone, depending on what estimate you're looking at, who took to the street, risking literally life and limbs because it was at a raging pandemic that was going on, to protest against the policing and against, but not just policing, but against economic inequality in the United States, largely led by young Black people, tell us that however that reassessment is, that is, maybe he put too much weight in that tension, but maybe he understood that is also an important space to theorize, maybe not to the same weight, but we cannot ignore both the inequality that exists within the Black community, as well as the inequality between the Black and white community, because this system is one that is extraordinarily opportunistic and unbelievably violent. And I'm sorry that I'm leaving that note, but I think that hopefully that help us a way forward to read this book in a different light, and understand that this book is absolutely essential to our thinking for a way forward.
Thank you so much for that, HLT Kwan. I just want to remind everyone who is watching us right now, please don't forget to ask your questions in the YouTube live stream. And with no further ado, I will hand over to Evia.
Thank you so much, Elif. So yeah, reading Marable's extraordinary text, I was constantly struck with this quite uneasy feeling of, well, how much it relates to now, but also knowing what comes next. So by the sort of 80s, you know, Marable is like already identifying how ways in which neoliberalism and mass incarceration are tearing Black communities apart as capital abandons them. And capital responded to the serious challenge and threat of revolution in the 60s and 70s. We've heard a little bit about that, by shifting production to the global south, helped along by automation. James Boggs writes great stuff about that, and information technology. The result is that Black Americans are pushed into what Marable calls a growing reserve army of labour. Surplus populations is another term. While capital protected itself by a shift in production, the state helped to quell all potential revolution through a combination of violent state repression and co-optation. And we know that FBI's COINTEL program murdered and framed revolutionaries and flooded Black communities with drugs in order to pacify all rebellion, thereby laying the groundwork for the underground economies that would proliferate Black communities once the factories had closed. And Manning lists a number of the sort of tactics of survival, as he calls it, employed by what Manning Marable, calls these tactics of survival, what he calls the sort of Black proletariat, and he refers to them as things like sex work, shoplifting, buying stolen goods, drug dealing, numbers running, robbery, gang membership. And these are all very familiar to me. So I was born in Britain in what might be called the subproletariat in the 1980s. And particularly the chapter 2 on the Black poor was all too familiar to me. As a baby, I was removed from my parents into foster care and eventually returned back about a year later. And I was lucky enough that my mum, who is autistic, and I was lucky that she had a lot of other sub-proletarians around to help raise me, but it was very hard. And I was raised by sex workers, by rent boys, drug addicts, people who were barely able to survive, but really good people who had almost nothing to give, but still managed to give something. So these pages were really speaking to a time period that was very, very familiar to me. And I wish I could say that since Marable wrote this book that things have got better for working class people, but they have not. Neoliberalism has torn apart all of those things that communities have needed to survive. Social housing has been sold off. Benefits come with more and more prerequisites and constant sanctions taking away people's benefits, and policing and surveillance has become all too normalised. Another element that was really interesting to me was Marable's identification of the Black bourgeoisie. He identifies them as being just as much to blame for the exploitation of the working classes, and demonstrates that they themselves have blamed the working class Black people for their own plight. And obviously there's still a big current of that among the right-wing Black bourgeoisie in Britain, like with this Tony Sewell race report, basically saying there's no such thing as institutional racism. But alongside that as well, we've also seen a new form of Black nationalism, so Afro-pessimism, which is, one in a long line of essentialist theories on inequality that tells you there's these people at the top, these people at the bottom, kind of flattening those dynamics, just like radical feminism did. Many theories such like that. But I think some of the indications that Marable provides around co-optation give us an understanding of how this has come to be and why this has become quite a popular current, this form of Black nationalism. And, for anyone who doesn't know, Afro-pessimism's sort of most controversial position is that there can be no solidarity between Black people and other people of colour, because the theory holds that all non-Black people are so imbued with anti-Blackness so as to make solidarity impossible. And in popular culture, one way in which these ideas are kind of expressed in Britain is through this idea of political Blackness. And this is a term that held a lot of currency in the 1970s in Britain, when anti-racist activists in squats developed a collective language to refer to all colonized people and to organize in solidarity. And it seems pretty dated today for people who we don't see as Black to call themselves Black. But it was something that was developed at a time that made sense to them. It's much misunderstood nowadays, and perhaps isn't the kind of language you want to use nowadays. But essentially, what happened since that time period, since those activists developed that language, you know, a lot of that's now been co-opted by the state. And part of the British state's attempt to co-opt the anti-racist movement meant things like inviting anti-racist groups to apply for state funding. So where anti-racist activists demanded housing, they were invited to apply for funding to run a hostel, maybe a Black hostel, maybe with a Black manager. But groups were encouraged to do so based on their ethnic background. So this led to a massive amount of competition for resources. And 30 years later, we're seeing the terminology that was started by anti-racists in those squats based on solidarity have turned into terms like BME and BAME, Black minority ethnic, Black and minority ethnic, that kind of thing. A problematic term, but as groups working in anti-racism were actually encouraged to apply based on the their own ethnic background, you can see how this competition for funding encouraged a sense of bitterness that other ethnic minorities were getting more money, and legitimizing some of these Afro-pessimist currents that we're seeing now in popular discourse, that Black people can't have solidarity with other people of colour and therefore must make a greater claim to injury in order to access dwindling resources in the precarious or diversity industry. And it's, you know, it's essentially like classic divide and rule tactic, pitting communities that were working together and were working in solidarity with each other, pitting them against each other. Classic. And although the diversity and inclusion industry is obviously beset with precarity, which fuels this sense of competition, it's, you know, still an industry that's largely made up of this socially mobile graduates, a bit like me. And I think it's interesting to see how this growing Black bourgeoisie, albeit a precarious one, is responding to this particular material issue that they're facing. And I think Marable's, you know, analysis on the Black bourgeoisie is quite revealing for some of that, for the moment that we're in now. And then Marable's chapter on the position of Black women I found very interesting. He name checks some of what you might call intersectionality's predecessors. Slightly problematically seen as that because, you know, I have a difficult relationship with intersectionality. But yeah, he talks about, you know, the triple burden, similar to Francis Bill's double jeopardy, later triple jeopardy by Third World Women's Alliance. He name checks the Canby River Collective and identifies Black women as being super exploited, a term coined by Claudia Jones. And I think some of the issues that those Black women that Manning identifies have really, those issues have really come to a head through neoliberalism, and I think actually through this pandemic. And the blunt instrument of lockdown, along with minimal social provisions, you know, in this country was, you know, essentially a failure, a desperate tactic resorted to when escalating hospitalization rates overwhelmed all other strategies. And these measures have mostly impacted those who are in overcrowded housing without any outdoor space. We've seen domestic violence go through the roof, and it's mostly women, and actually disproportionately women of colour, who have been expected to keep everyone alive through this pandemic, through super exploitation. Through the super exploitation of being expected to work inside the home and outside the home, whilst caring for children and elderly and disabled relatives with no respite. And those lockdowns that women have been expected to sort of carry have been enforced through policing and borders. And in reality, it's disproportionately people of colour and migrants who have experienced a policed lockdown in Britain. The mobilisations of the security forces as agents of public health have quite predictably led to injustices and ramped up surveillance and institutional racism. And in locked down London, racist stop and search operations by cops increased massively. And those committed to social justice have been kind of left a little bit shocked and uncertain of how to mount a serious challenge to the government's ineptitude, and actually quite quickly accepted just this limited call for people to just stay indoors with little else being offered to support people to stay safe. And many actually supported criminal justice enforced lockdowns and the closing of national borders as a viable strategy to manage the spread of virus. The mainstream response to the pandemic has treated it as biological rather than social phenomena, but it's, you know, a zoonotic virus spreading from animals to humans is because of capitalism. It's not because of biology. It's not it's not spread because individuals attempt to see their dying relatives or by creating support bubbles. And for many working class people, and working class people of colour particularly, social distancing has been a myth, many forced to spend 24 hours a day in damp and overcrowded conditions, and the very conditions that actually spread the virus. And actually an Irish traveller comrade of mine who's very young, in her early 20s, told me that she's twice had COVID and now has long COVID because of the overcrowded conditions on her campsite, mean that social distancing was never a possibility. And these are social problems, and they're disproportionately managed by working class women and women of colour, and really demonstrate the sort of logical conclusion of the conditions of managed decline that Marable highlights, 30, 40 years ago. And Marable's like kind of finish on this sort of call to arms for a socialist solution to the mess is something that appeals to me, although I'm probably more of an anarchist or anarcho-syndicalist type person. I think the current political moment we're in is an important one. Although over the last year there was widespread acceptance of police lockdowns, we've seen significant resistance to policing, punishment, and surveillance more recently. In the summer of 2020, Black Lives Matter led the charge that freedom of assembly was of critical importance in response to the murder of George Floyd, whilst fostering a recognition that racism itself is an underlying health condition, and is the reason for the disproportionate deaths of Black and brown people from COVID. Black Lives Matter was inspirational because despite COVID, tens of millions of people gathered in streets and squares across the US, the UK, and across the world, and they demonstrated and shifted the political terrain. They did all this safely, outdoors, mostly masked, and with no evidence that the action sparked any trigger in infections. So here in Britain, despite that, our Home Secretary, Priti Patel, seemed pretty adamant that she would leave protest off the most recent list of reasonable excuses to assemble outside during the most recent lockdown. And this is understood to be a direct response to the Black Lives Matter demonstrations last summer. The circumstances surrounding the murder of Sarah Everard recently and the subsequent policing of the vigil held in her name has actually started a pistol on a movement against the encroachment of an increasingly authoritarian government. The vigil held at Clapham Common last month was called in response to the police advice to women in the area to stay at home after dark as they investigated Sarah's disappearance. By the time of the vigil, a serving Metropolitan Police officer had been charged with her murder, with details of the Met failing to take action against this individual for indecent exposure reports made days before Sarah went missing. Despite the Metropolitan Police maintaining that the vigil would not be legally facilitated by them due to COVID regulations, Sisters Uncut and other feminist activists insisted on attending the vigil because it was seen as, again, critically important to challenge the police in their assertion that protest in assembly was illegal under COVID-19 regulations. And that challenge was of pivotal importance given the mounting criticism the Met was facing that week. The police crackdown of the vigil and the police brutality that they meted out on the women at that vigil led to widespread condemnation of police brutality and actually opened up a space in which people from across the political spectrum questioned the suitability of telling women that the police are their protectors in a week in which evidence of police violence towards women, both on and off duty, was mounting. Witnessing the images of police brutality towards women at the vigil for Sarah Everard led many to question why the police were being offered yet more powers through the Police and Crime Sentencing Bill. So over the past month, we've seen a national movement against the authoritarian nature of this bill, which doesn't only pose a danger to women, but also expands stop and search powers, which will disproportionately impact Black and Brown communities. It criminalises Gypsy Roma travellers for their way of life. It makes protest in all but the majority, it makes protest in the majority of cases illegal. And it brings in criminalisation of sex work, likely to make life for sex workers, particularly migrant sex workers, far more dangerous. But I don't actually see it necessarily this sort of mounting this challenge to policing. You know, it's not just about, oh, the police make our lives more difficult. You know, policing and prisons is one of, if not the major barrier to all of us being able to live a dignified life and to be able to create the life we want to create. They brutalise us on our picket lines when we organise for better conditions. They infiltrate our movements when we take direct action to stop corporations extracting every last resource from our planet through neo-colonialism. Or when we organise to hold them accountable for murdering members of our community. They evict us from our homes and from our encampments. When some of us can't or don't want to work a 9-to-5 job, they criminalise our earnings, such as in the sex industry. They deport us when we seek a better life. And this bill is another in a long line of measures taken by the state to quell our resistance, to stop us in our tracks in achieving the conditions of life that we deserve, because they will not tolerate a challenge to their authority or a penny less in their pockets. But this bill targets so many people, it creates solidarities between people who ordinarily would not see themselves as having solidarity with each other. Gypsy Roma travellers organising with sex workers, Black and Brown communities organising with feminists. This is the first opportunity of my generation to mount a serious challenge to policing and prisons. And in so doing, shift the conversation to make enough space to start to imagine a different way of running life, as Marable implores us all to do. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Avia and HLT Kwan and Paul Heidemann. I mean, I think this has been a really crucial discussion, of course, about Manning Marable's How Capitalism Underdeveloped Black America, but also many of the issues that the work touches on. And of course, as has been evident in the presentation, still crucially relevant today. I want to, because we don't have that much time left, I want to ask my initial question. And I think this is one of the things that hasn't really been touched tonight, but that's also because, of course, particularly the book and the work covers so much. But we've spoken about, you know, police, crime, and other mechanisms of the state, and how, particularly in the last few years, but of course not limited to it, has been exposed as, of course, inherently authoritarian. But I think another issue that has been discussed in somewhat a bit of an unprecedented way, I think, is that there's a general wide acceptance that this is quite a concerted strategy of in this case, with what Avia said about the British state, but of course states in general, as the state cannot respond to the social issues that it is creating. Of course, it employs more and more authoritarian measures when it comes to police and responses to, quote unquote crime. But I want to connect that to the understanding that this system and the direction this is all going is an international issue, in terms of, one, that the state system, the state as a system rather, is going in that direction internationally. So with the understanding that, this system is international and therefore our struggle against it must be, I want to ask a question about, in some ways, what Manning Marable's work, or how it can potentially inform a 21st century internationalism. Because when he was writing this, one crucial thing that exists in a very institutional way didn't exist in the same way at the time, and that's the so-called global war on terror. And I think this is a crucial thing to understand when we're talking about, the internationalism. Avia spoke about the solidarity that has been garnered, particularly in response and opposing this bill. But of course, this connection and this struggle must be necessarily international for it to be successful. So I guess, this has been a bit of a long-winded way of explaining it, but, in those times, particularly in the 20th century, things like the non-aligned alliance and the internationals, the various internationals, were able to exist. But we don't see such a formation, particularly since the so-called global war on terror. So I guess, what can the response to that be? Through how Manning Marable's work can inform that, but also, not limited to that. I'll start with HLT Kwan. I want to come to Avia at the end, because I think also kind of bringing it to the UK context, which is most people watching us tonight, will be quite crucial. So yeah, maybe Professor Kwan, and then Paul, and then Avia.
Well, first I just want to say, thank you, Dr. Day. That was just amazing. It was so rich and so nice to hear, to hear from the report from the ground, if you will. Well, I would say that it's true that when this work was first released, there was the international movement, the international movement against apartheid, right? Was very robust. There was the international solidarity movement with the Palestinian people. That was also very robust. So, and you're right, there was the Non-Aligned and the Third World Alliance, and all of these groups that were explicit in their internationalist grounding. On the other hand, I would say that the Zapatistas, for instance, as my colleague Alan Gomez always remind me, the Zapatistas are always informing and continue to inform generations of young activists, including BLM activists, on the ground. There are international networks of sex workers. There are the indigenous, there are transnational indigenous movement for global justice, for land and food sovereignty. This last summer, BLM chapters open all over the world. What's different is that people really do understand that it is not okay to universalize one experience and homogenize the local character. What young activists today understand, young and old, intergenerational alliances understand that while we think globally, we have to act locally. And so in Japan alone, there are more than half a dozen BLM chapters, but they are focusing on the way in which the Japanese police are treating Black people and Koreans, right? And Southeast Asian migrants very viciously and very differently. And they're appropriating BLM strategies and racial analysis, but they are paying attention to the local dynamic. So I think the loose affinity, the lack of hierarchical structure, the visible structure, I think makes it harder for us to see. But as I always caution folks, we should never mistaken silences with absences, right? So because they don't dominate the daily news or the corporate media pages, that doesn't mean they're not there, on the one hand. On the other hand, you are right, in the after, in the post September 11 world, and in the increasing predominance of the national security state, it is also harder because of the technology that's proliferated for surveillance and data gathering. It is harder for international activists to collaborate and to be explicitly radical in a way that it was okay and encouraged. So for instance, there are a lot of gagging going around against the solidarity movement for the people of Palestine. There are laws in the book in some states and municipalities that literally gag activists and students and scholars from speaking out in solidarity with the people of Palestinian. And that's a problem. That is a serious, serious problem. But some of us were members of the ANC, the African National Congress, when both the Reagan administration and the apartheid regime identified the ANC as a terrorist organization. We never saw ourselves as terrorists, right? We saw ourselves as member of an international solidarity movement. And so I think that's different. I don't know if I answer your question.
Thank you. And Paul?
Yeah, I mean, so interestingly, so Marable was actually on, Democracy Now!, Amy Goodman's radio show the day after September 11th in New York, the very, very beginning of the war on terror. And I was just looking up what he said, and it was very prescient. He said, look, this is going to lead to he was like, look, we need to say, we're in solidarity with victims of terror and we reject terrorism. But we have to be clear that the main political impact of this is going to be expanded American imperialism and a horrible wave of anti-Arab and anti-Muslim racism at home. And of course, he was exactly right about that. And I think theoretically, some of the resources Marable provides is, you see it in this book and you see it in the work from the rest of his life. Marable was centrally concerned with how you democratize the state, right? How do you make inroads of democracy into the state? And he understood that the warfare state, the national security state, is inherently anti-democratic and is an anti-democratic project of capital and the state at the end of the day. And I think that's a perspective that's really useful in that we don't always think about kind of the project of democracy at home and anti-imperialism being joined together. We often think about, opposing American imperialism is about the struggle for democracy and, the countries that are the victims of American imperialism, which is of course true. But I think Marable's perspective helps us see that democratizing the state in the United States, making the state democratically accountable, is something that's inherently in tension with or inherently corrosive of the war-making powers of the state, right? The war-making powers and the national security powers are always ones that are based on a certain kind of bureaucratic fiat, unaccountable power in the state. And so I think, and this is something Marable wrote more about towards the end of his life, in the last decade of his life, thinking about kind of radical democracy and the project of democratizing the state. And I think that's something really useful to bring into thinking about anti-imperialism today, and to bring into thinking about how we think about our opposition to the warfare state.
So yeah, reflecting on that question, one of the things that kind of springs to mind is how much things have changed in terms of the state's response to the way it polices and surveils like different racialized populations. And so I was chatting earlier a little bit about the way in which the state co-opted anti-racist movements, but another thing that it did was to police different populations in different ways, you know, kind of a colonial like legacy of policing Black communities in one way and Asian communities another way. And you know, back in the sort of 60s, 70s, 80s in Britain, a lot of that meant that much of the sort of immigration side of things tended to be levied at Asian communities, and Black communities had to deal with things like sus laws, the you know, the sort of stop and search of its time, and the policing in the community itself, and that's kind of really shifted actually. The state seems to have lost its appetite to differentiate between different racialized communities, and we've kind of seen that more recently with the hostile environment on immigration, kind of just hitting all and everyone who you know, even people who have British nationality can have their nationality being taken away, and people of color in general. And you know, we've seen this with the Windrush scandal, with you know, people that have, you know, come over to Britain in the 50s, 60s and 70s, from the Caribbean. Often the sort of, you know, Labour Party would sort of, you know, see these as building the NHS and celebrate this generation, and those you know, older generation have also been deported, have also had the hostile environment levied against them. And the flip side of that, with the, you know, talking about the global war on terror, and we have this thing called the prevent duty, where, you know, mostly young Muslims can be informed onto the state for, you know, as little as deciding they want to start wearing a hijab one week. Can be informed on to be you know, at risk of radicalization in this kind of prevent style duty of they call it, to try and address the you know, the war on terror, etc. And that was something that was generally you know, directed at Muslims, at brown Muslims, and now with this bill they want to use the same prevent duty against Black gang members. So, you know, they seem to have really got their you know, lost their appetite to kind of try and split Black and Asian people or people of color by policing and monitoring and surveilling them in different ways, and actually just use any kind of technology and any kind of anything they have at their disposal, and, you know, to treat all people of color more or less in the same way, using the same techniques and strategies. And again, I think actually, you know, those are the things that differentiation was the kind of thing that tended to divide anti-racist movements and demobilize anti-racist movements, and siphon off a lot of that work. But now again, you know, the way in which they're using these techniques is actually bringing a lot of solidarity between people, as people are much more obviously seeing the overlap between their experience and other people's experience and other people of color's experience. And so I think it was going to be extremely important to not only leave it at that, but actually draw the links, make that analysis, to organize in our communities, proactively making those links, because I think, you know, the reason why those techniques, they use those techniques to divide in the past, was because they knew how powerful and dangerous people could be by organizing together. So I think it's going to be absolutely critically important to link those things, and to sort of take the opportunity and to strategize around that. But yeah, thanks a lot.
Can I just add something? You know, in the last chapter of how Capitalism Underdeveloped Black America, Marable uses the term genocide to characterize the systematic violence targeting the Black community. That, of course, was that, of course, was sort of harkened back to the 1951 state petition to the UN, which charged genocide. And it's interesting to note that only a couple of years ago, a group of Black youth in Chicago collect evidence prior to all of these mass protests on the street, collect all this evidence about police violence, and they charge genocide. I think it's important to understand that capitalism, racial capitalism, is an international system. It's a global system. And so we have to have a global sort of response, because I think your website said, until all of us are free, none of us are free. And that's right, because these are spaces of capital and they're all over. But that there is a continuous effort on the part of grassroots mobilization, particularly Black-led, that are transnational in character. So Black feminists, for instance, have been consistently anti-imperialist from the late 19th century, but well before that, I suspect that we can have documentation, but certainly documented since the late 19th century, throughout the 20th, well into the 21st, they are consistently anti-imperialist. They're consistently furnish us with a very robust critique of capitalism. And in that chapter, that Marable barely scratched the surface, that point to precisely people like Claudia Jones and others, for us to go and find it ourselves. So we need to do that. We need to keep doing that.
Thank you so much. I mean, there are so many more questions to ask, but we've unfortunately run out of time. I think this is also a testament to just how, broad this discussion could have been. One could obviously, and what people obviously do design courses precisely based on this work. But thank you so much for this incredibly enriching discussion. Just as a very short reminder, if you are in the UK on May Day, there will be demonstrations all across the country mobilizing to kill the bill, which is obviously this proposed police bill. In London, it will be at 12 o'clock in Trafalgar Square. I'm not exactly sure about other parts of the country, but I think particularly on the Sisters Ankar and Women's Strike social medias, all of these will be readily available. There could be so much to discuss about so many of these topics, but thank you very much for joining us this evening, everyone who has watched us, and of course our incredible speakers. And just as closing remarks, please visit leftbookclub.com if you want to become a member, and subscribe to our newsletter. Follow the Left Book Club on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, and don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel before you leave us tonight. Especially during May, we're going to have many enriching events because it's Radical May. On the 6th of May at 7 p.m. UK time, we will have an event on Rosa Luxemburg, Socialism or Barbarism, with Peter Hoodis, Eric Blanc, Joanna Busama, and Dilar Dirik. On the 13th of May, at the same time, we will have a work on anti-capitalism and work with Vijay Prashad, Dalia Gabriel, Amelia Horgan, and Gargi Bhattacharya. You can find all the details for these events on our social media, so please register for them. And again, thank you very much for joining us tonight, and have a great evening, and see you next time.